Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. Seems like a year since I've done a video, which is in fact the case because this is the first video of 2019. It's my weekly wrap up, first one of the year. Just to say I'm halfway through On the Origins of Stories, Evolution, Cognition and Fiction by Brian Boyd. I'm not going to say anything about this now, I'll wait till I've finished it and then get into it. But I have read 3 works of fiction, and the first of these, Denis Johnson, The Stars at Noon. So last year I read 2 Denis Johnson books. I read The Largesse of the Sea Maiden, which was a collection of short stories. I think his last one before his death. And the other was a novel called Train Dreams, which is a beautiful, elegiac story about sort of how the American lifestyle and landscape was changing under the influence of technology at the end of the 19th century. This is a totally different style. This is, really sort of surprised me in a good way. This is sort of choppy and anxious and the opposite of elegiac. So it's but no less successful, which I think is a sort of test to Johnson's skill as an author. It's about self-destructive characters, and where do self-destructive characters go in order to destruct? Well, they go to sort of hellholes in the world, which more often than not are combat zones. And in this case, it's got a setting I don't think I've ever come across before in a novel, which was sort of Sandinista Nicaragua in 1984, where the left-wing Marxist government, which had poets in its cabinet, were under severe threat from the CIA US-backed Contras to overthrow their revolution. And interestingly, the Sandinista were, as far as I know, still the only Marxist government to hand power back through a defeat at the ballot box when they lost an election, and they handed power back. Anyway, the Nicaragua here really is a hellhole. I don't know if it's sort of part of Nicaragua is equatorial or how close it is to the equator, but it is unfeasibly hot. Too hot to do anything in. The Sandinista are blockaded by Americans, in a way Cuba is, so there's just nothing in the country, absolutely nothing, other than the idealism of its ruling Communist Party. Anyway, so the main character is a woman who, is she a journalist? Is she a spy? Is she there on some sort of industrial espionage? Is she a prostitute? Whatever she is, she's a screw-up. And she forms a relationship with another guy who, ironically, is the only one who's demonstrated any kind of morality in the novel, in that he works for an oil company who is in Nicaragua to see if anything can be done to deal with the Sandinista in order to export their oil or drive a pipeline through or something. And the neighbouring country of Nicaragua is Costa Rica, and basically he sees that it's a sort of a one-sided sort of trading of information, so he evens up the side, he sort of spills the beans to the other party, so both parties know the same information, and that makes him an enemy of the Costa Ricans. So he is knows that he has to flee the country, and the woman joins up with him, and they sort of are on this journey to get out of the country, which is much more difficult, A, because it's a sort of Marxist country with lots of surveillance, B, because they stand out like a sore thumb, C, the woman has, one of her destructive acts is that she is carrying a lot of currency, and people think that she's, if she's not to do with the CIA and helping transfer money to the Contras, that she's worse, she's a black marketeer in currency. So it's all very difficult. The first time they meet and they have sex, he pays her for it. He pays her $50. But after that, they fall in, seemingly in love. But the tension in the book is because, they're trying to flee the country, because the Costa Ricans are after them, and you never quite know how the Sandinistas regard them. Are they CIA spies? In which case they would, be enemies of the state. Who is going to betray who? Or is love going to prevail? And that is, that is basically the book. I'm just going to read you a quick section, just to give you an idea of how good a writer Johnson is. So this is when they're on the run. Then we'd ask our questions. I've experienced starvation and thirst, but never the drained, aching need for information. Anything, the smallest piece of data, left or right, near or far, open or closed. Is there a garage, a constabulary outpost, a meal, a drink, what time, how far, that powered our movement along the edges of those towns. I got so that I trusted most the mean-looking jungle farmers trudging along by the road with their straw cowboy hats and machetes, and hard brown flat bare feet like shapeless boots. But they were just as dumb as the others, completely in the dark as to what I was asking, but not in the least reluctant to dish up an answer, giving me directions to places that will never exist, in colloquial phrases complicated by something they always seem to be chewing or sucking, and contradicted by their sign language, a mix of rabbit punches in reverse and caresses enacted on the air. So I think as an exercise in style, as an exercise in atmosphere, and as an exercise in sort of screw-up characters, self-destructive characters, this is a great book, but I'm not quite sure it tells an interesting story as a whole. So I thought 4 stars because of the style, because the characters are quite interesting, but I couldn't give it 5, unlike Train Dreams, because I couldn't quite see there was a story in here. Anyway, and on to the next book, Tibor Fischer, How to Rule the World. This is the 4th Tibor Fischer book I've read, and I was really looking forward to this because he hadn't released anything in a while, and I was quite hungry for something else by him, and this came out last year and I missed it, and only a sort of random check, and I saw that it had come out, so I bought it. It's still in hardback. I don't think it's out in paperback yet. This was really, really disappointing. Easily the weakest of the 4 books of his that I've read. It's misanthropic. Now, in a way, Johnson's book has misanthropes, characters who hate themselves and hate everybody else in the world, as hopefully the extract I read suggested. But, you know, there's depth, there's emotional, you know, sort of reasons behind it. Here, the misanthropy is unremitting, has no salvation at the end of it. It's all in the pursuit of a good joke, or a seemingly good joke. So the main character is a failed documentary maker in the world populated by other documentary makers who are all on the make, but none of them, you know, can catch a break. Because, you know, documentary, I imagine it's quite hard to make a living as a documentary filmmaker. And it's a sea of sharks that he operates in, but they're sort of listless sharks. They can't even get the energy up to do anything than sort of backbite each other. And if I felt that Johnson didn't have a story, I mean, this absolutely had nothing in its centre, no heart, no message, nothing. It was just on to the next joke. And what was weird stylistically is, you know, how it plunges, you know, from paragraph to paragraph. You know, on the one hand, it can be a sort of a rant about sort of, you know, globalisation or war. On the other, it can be, you know, the state of the pavements in South London. It just sort of swoops like that all the time. And it's very much an internal voice, narrating what he's doing, what he sees, how people behave, how badly people behave, his own failings. But it just didn't hold together at all, really. So I'm going to read, there's not much more to say about this. As I say, there's nothing at the centre of this. So I'm going to read 2 short extracts, and you can decide, because the thing about Tibor Fischer's other books is, A, they were funny, and B, you know, there was something to the characters. There was a bit of sort of heart and a bit of sort of psychological authenticity, which is lacking here. So I'm going to read these 2 things, and you can see if, you know, this is the type of sense of humour for you. For me, this was misanthropic humour, and therefore had no saving grace about it. Anyway, the first one is one of the better bits. So 2 of the documentary film guys are talking about another one who's committed suicide. I nod. I have heard about Jim. Found hanging from a tie in a hotel room in Nairobi with Japanese octopus porn playing on a large plasma screen. What is it about my gender? They can't give their knobs 5 minutes peace. The only surprise was that Jim had a tie. So that was one of the better, slightly more witty sections. And this, I just think, is nasty and sort of beyond the moral pale, really. I had heard that Gary Graham had been killed, yet another documentary filmmaker. I was slightly annoyed about it. He was stabbed. Of violent deaths, it's the most glam. It means something. Some kids play with a gun half a mile away and you're dead. Bullets go all over the place. They roam way beyond your eyesight. Most soldiers can barely see their targets or never do. Anyone can die in a car crash or get run over because someone's changing the music. But stabbing is personal. It's never accidental like a gun just going off. Someone stabs you to death, and death typically requires a lot of stabbing. They mean it. And Graham was so boring. He never did or said anything interesting or funny in his whole life. He made tedious docs about tedious health issues because no one else wanted to. He didn't deserve to die that way because he hadn't earned it. Well, as I say, I think that's sort of beyond the moral pale, irrespective of the fact that this book is set in South London, where there is currently an epidemic of stabbings. You know, it's not a dissimilar thing to sort of saying, you know, rape victims deserve to be raped because of what they wear. This guy didn't deserve to be stabbed. He deserved to die in another way because he wasn't interesting enough to be stabbed. Yeah, I didn't enjoy that. I gave it 3. I could have possibly even gave it lower, really. And on to the last book, The Melancholy of Anatomy by Shelley Jackson, which is a book of short stories, all based around, or I don't know if based around, inspired by the sort of Jacobean system of medical belief, which was that there were 4 essential fluids in the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and what's the other one? I think that was yellow bile. And that when they're all in balance, you have a person whose sort of emotions are in balance. But if one is in sort of dominates over the other, that will determine your character type. So, for example, if you have too much black bile, you'll be melancholic. If you have too much yellow bile, you'll be choleric, or, you know, angry all the time. Too much blood means you're sanguine, and too much phlegm means you're phlegmatic. And, you know, Shakespeare used this. It was the current sort of medical and psychological sort of model of sort of Jacobean period. And Jackson uses that to structure this book, where there are 4 sections, 1 to each of the essential sort of character types: melancholy, phlegmatic, all that. And what she does is she brings things that are normally inside the body or hidden outside into full view, and they sort of take on either spiritual or outlandish sides or fairy tale or scientific forms. And it's another way to look at things that are normally sort of hidden. So, for example, milk is our milk clouds. One of my favourite stories is Blood, where the city of London in Victorian times, it has annual periods or menses, and there are a crew of women who go into the sewers, and they wear these sort of cotton coats to soak up the blood so that London doesn't get flooded with blood. So, as I say, it's sort of, I wouldn't say magical realism. This is not magical realism. This is more akin to what Ben Marcus does, or even David Eagleman, who just takes the familiar or the everyday, or in this case the unseen and hidden parts of our body that we take for granted, puts them outside the body, and then infuses them with, you know, powers that make us think and regard them in different ways. Now, not all the stories were successful. So I loved Blood. I loved the story called Phlegm, whereby people sort of hoiking up phlegm, and that phlegm sort of takes on a sort of totemic or almost sort of, you know, religious value, and it determines lots of sort of social interaction, so that when you shake hands, you know, you have phlegm into it, you know, in the palm of your hand, and you transfer that to the other person, which is a much more literal, in a way, sort of, you know, giving of yourself, introducing yourself to someone else, and just a handshake. It's sort of one level on. There's another story called Egg, the first story, which I didn't enjoy as much, and is twice as long as all the other stories. I couldn't quite see that because it kept repeating itself, but it had a tremendous sort of sensory, sensual feel, whereby the character, you know, there's a sort of giant egg, and the main character sort of, you know, obviously has some sort of sexual, you know, relationship to it, and at one point she actually enters the egg, she drives in through the outer shell, and the description of, you know, sort of flesh going into flesh, which obviously stands as a sort of metaphor for, you know, sex itself. But that was really well done, but I thought she sort of overplayed it, to be honest. What other stories did I enjoy here? There's a story called Cancer, which was, despite its sort of rather grim, embodiment of what it was, this was a sort of a benign cancer and a sort of had a sort of pastoral role for the characters. Oh yes, Sleep was the other one I really liked, whereby sleep is a sort of a physical thing, and it's out of that material you could like sculpt like a clone of yourself, and that clone would then take over your life, and you could escape and go and pursue your dreams, or if you felt trapped you could escape. And I thought that was a really nice idea. But there are other stories that didn't work at all for me. So there's Sperm, which didn't work. I can't remember what it was about now. There's one called Dildo, Nerve, which almost worked but didn't quite. So for me this was a mixed bag. It's an interesting idea. It's done well in parts, less well in others. I gave this 3.5 stars. So there you have it. In terms of my upcoming reads, well, as I say, I shall hopefully finish this. And the other, I'm starting Lincoln in the Bardo on Monday. It's part of my quest about interesting ways of writing about death. And then I start a buddy read on the 20th of January with Jason over Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and we're buddy reading Olverton. Okay, so that's all. Till next time, thanks very much.